Thank you very much for this warm and highly flattering introduction, which makes me a little bit nervous now and self-conscious. But it's a great pleasure to be back here. It was a great experience to meet this research project, this group of scholars working on this research project, and to be here with you and to be back here with you. Thank you for inviting me. And what I want to do here is, this doesn't seem to be working. Yes. So what I want to do here today is that I think that studying intermediality at this time is somehow gaining a special and new momentum exactly through these various vigorous new research projects around different university centers. And the way I arrange these cards there is deliberately showing a bit of a mess. So there's a whole variety and heterogeneity of approaches to intermediality studies, and I would like to address this heterogeneity now. And myself being at the crossroads, at the intersection of two research projects, having finished one and preparing the publication from the first one and just starting a new research project, I tried to reflect on the state of the art of intermediality studies, and I would like to share with you some of my conclusions. And so therefore, bear with me. I will speak in the first part of my talk about things that you probably know already, and then I will share briefly my own conclusions or thoughts about our own researches that we conducted, and some areas where these may all lead. So there's a forest of intermediality studies, and I would like to show you some of the avenues that can be explored within this forest. So this will be briefly what I am going to talk about. So the first chapter, so to speak, is mapping the theoretical field. And well, this can't be a map in such a short time, a sketch merely. And addressing these key questions of blurring the borders or being in between. Now, the metaphor of media borders is one of the most persistent notions in the study of intermediality, as we all know. Irina Rajewski considers the crossing of media borders, in fact, as a founding category of intermediality. By now talking of blurred borders and media trespasses have not only entered the vocabulary of intermedial analysis, but they have also become somewhat blurry figures of speech themselves, often divorced of a specific theoretical background. Nevertheless, I think we should keep in mind that the rhetoric based on the metaphor of media borders originates in a particular perspective that defines a very important and broad avenue in intermedial studies. Theoretical writings based on such border talks conceive intermediality as a relationship between media and are concerned with typologies of modalities and operations that define an intermediate relationship. Broadly speaking, according to such typologies, by crossing the borders, A, media are fused, combined, integrated, incorporated to form a complex multimedial or hybrid entity. B, media, that is media forms, features, and products, are represented, referenced by other media. Or C, characteristics are transposed, transmediated in Lars Ellerström's vocabulary, transsemioticized in Gaudreau and Marion's book, transformed or remediated. Now, such typologies make use of diverse theories of communication. but ultimately they are rooted in semiotics and aspire to produce a conceptual framework for identifying intermediate relations and to elaborate a universal grammar of intermediality of sorts, applicable to the analysis of a variety of media phenomena. As such, it is conceived primarily as a branch of media studies, which it attempts to fine-tune and amend. On the one hand, looking further back for connections, we may see a great affinity in this type of research with the tradition of aesthetics dealing with the idea of the sister arts, the rivalry and limitation of specific art forms. On the other hand, this avenue connects surprisingly easily to the relatively newer area of transmedia or media convergence studies of the digital age, despite their completely opposite premise. That is, instead of the emphasis of media borders, convergence studies presuppose that such borders have already collapsed in the so-called post-media age. So although these deal with the merging of formally distinct media technologies and media forms within a digital environment and a convergence culture where old and new media meet in, I quote, a flow of content across multiple media platforms, using the famous words of Henry Jenkins, the focus is similarly on categories and operations in a perspective that is essentially, I think, the flip side of intermedial border talks. Now, the alternative to the border metaphor can be seen in the idea of in-betweenness. At first sight, this latter might seem derivative of the former, and indeed the metaphor does occur in writings which fall in the first type outlined here, which briefly acknowledge the existence of, I quote, liminal, contact, or border zones. Nevertheless, there is also a vast and far more heterogeneous area of a variety of theoretical approaches which describe some sort of in-betweenness based on different philosophical perspectives and which have usually very little to do with the hardline scholarship of intermediality outlined before. Bernd Herzogenrath, for example, observes, quoting the Fluxus artist Dick Higgins's words, who coined the term intermedia in 1966, that intermedium is not only, I quote, the uncharted land that lies between, in the sense that it comprises the links and crossbreeds between various art forms, but also in the sense of connecting various disciplines with which we talk about these media. So, thus, while the border metaphor prevails in the attempt to forge a solid theoretical framework for a single discipline of intermedial studies dealing with all media forms, the metaphor of in-betweenness does not only suggest an impossibility of pinning down the boundaries, a state of instability, of being in the blur, rather than the act of blurring formerly distinct entities. It is also a key notion which opens the way to the absorption of different methodologies, as well as a multiplication of perspectives regarding the phenomena of intermedialities. Now, post-structuralist philosophies have been the most productive in the exploration and the opening up of this blurry domain of the in-between. One could not even attempt a comprehensive survey here, so let me just make a few cursory references. Based on Deleuze, for example, Herzogenrath considers that intermediality is the media version of the plane of immanence, of the fractal surface, which is not to say that first there are different media and then there is intermediality. This rhizomatic intermediality is the quasi-ontological plane underlying all media, out of which the specific media that we know percolates, so to speak. End of quotation. Now, intermediality as an in-betweenness of space time and media forms have often been articulated through Foucault's notion of heterotopia. Then again, in-betweenness has also been theorized not as a place, a state, but in terms of Lyotard's notion of the figural, with strong links to phenomenology and psychoanalysis. So actually the figural, I think, is the best possible metaphor or image for in-betweenness in intermedial sense. To quote Lyotard himself, the figural arises as an interword in the text, something, I quote, a linguistic space cannot incorporate without being shaken, an exteriority it cannot interiorize a signification, but something that remains steadfastly within the sensory. Now, in his book, Reading the Figural, David Rodovic argues that the figural can be seen as a transversal concept that can demolish the illusory divide of the textual versus visual from both sides, and reverses Lyotard's perspective, who starts from observing the text, by identifying the work of the figural within the media hybridity of cinema, where its effect is to challenge the self-coherence of the visual. It is actually Joachim Pech who explicitly applies the notion of cinematic intermediality to cinematic intermediality, defining it, I quote, as a perceivable figure of media difference which disturbs the order of the discourse as a radical heterogeneity. Now, viewing intermediality in terms of the figural is therefore, as I said, a wonderful model of in-betweenness. For instead of delimiting media boundaries, it reveals their imbrication. Moreover, if we remember Lyotard's poetic description linking the figural with beauty, the sublime, and what he calls, I quote, the untamed silence of art, standing as a plasticity and a desire, a curved expanse against invariability, we can see that the figural not only brings a welcome leap into the void, in Rodovic's words, of in-betweenness, but it may highlight what is singular in each instance of intermediality, much in the spirit of Dick Higgins's original idea that intermedial works are, I quote, not governed by rules, each work determines its own medium and form according to its needs. As such, this line of thought, influenced by diverse strands of so-called post-structuralist philosophies, leads the way in the exploration of intermediality not as an abstract set of relationships, that is a kind of grammar, but as an ever-changing aesthetic configuration and a sensuously perceivable excess. While the previous avenue of intermedial studies is heading in one specific direction, that is the general theory of intermediality, this type of scholarship, which has gained much traction in film studies, has successfully decentered the field, both with an emphasis on dealing with specific instances of intermediality through analysis of works, auteurs, or stylistic trends in diachronic or synchronic cross-section, and with freely adopting and combining concepts not only from media studies or philosophy, but from a wide range of disciplines, including film theory, art history, aesthetics, psychology, anthropology, etc. Now, this paradigm was also recently reinforced by studies focusing on the liminal in cultural and post-colonial studies, which similarly use the idea of in-betweenness in interpreting historical, cultural, social, and psychological phenomena. Now, a third paradigm that I see emerging in this intermedial studies area is remapping intermediality and rethinking in-betweenness. Now, moving beyond the widespread influence of post-structuralism, the most intriguing new perspectives into thinking about intermediality in cinema have been brought by recent philosophers and film theorists like Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, Giorgio Agamben, or Raymond Bellour. who have explicitly written about cinema and offered new vantage points for interpreting its hybridity. Although these theoretical approaches are far from being similar in many respects, there are a few aspects that loosely connect them. For example, without mentioning the term intermediality, they all implicitly point towards expanding the area to be considered in intermediality studies beyond media. They suggest diverse possibilities to radically rethink, this time, not the media border metaphor, but another core assumption of intermediality, namely that it is something that happens between media, that its relevance extends to relations between media. Alain Badiou interprets the designation of the seventh art, as we all know, not as indicative of the position of cinema among the arts, but of the way it is constituted. It is not simply another art added to the succession of previously existing ones, but as he famously says, it is the plus one of the arts in the sense that it operates on the other arts, using them as its starting point in a movement that subtracts them from themselves. And although the metaphor of breached borders resurfaces in his arguments, he also makes it clear that any movement from one art to another is a false one, a subtraction, I quote, an allusive quotation of the other arts, through which we have a fleeting passage of an idea, like a visitation. Cinema working essentially as an art of memory. For as Badiou writes, I quote, "What I will have seen or heard lingers on to the very extent that it passes." Reviving André Bazin's metaphor of impurity, he considers cinema to be an impure art, a knot that ties together the movements in which cinema not only, I quote, wrests these arts away from themselves, but also connects in various ways to the domain of non-art and becomes contaminated by it. Accordingly, cinema as artistic practice can be conceived as a never completed, I quote, process of purification of its own immanent non-artistic character. Now we see a similar gesture of extending and remapping the area where cinema and thinking about cinema operates on the principle of in-betweenness in Jacques Rancière's recent writings, only instead of Badiou's vision of multiplying and binding together divergent aspects of cinema, Rancière pulls them apart, so to speak, by emphasizing the gaps or intervals, les écarts of cinema. Questioning the very unity of the art, he states, "Cinema exists only as a set of irreducible gaps between things that have the same name without being members of a single body." Now, the gaps of cinema, he writes, are the result of cinema being other to itself, this internal heterogeneity producing extensions or relations with literature, politics, and other art forms. Gaps and extensions make cinema overflow itself. Giorgio Agamben joins the rank of the contemporary philosophers who venture into these non-cinematic fields, not only through considering film as a nexus of relationships between differently constituted objects and practices, and as the champion of what Janet Harbord, the author of a recent monograph on his work, calls eccentric cinema, driven by a veritable fascination with what is external to it, but most of all through dislodging the image from the center of discourse on cinema. Thus, for Agamben, cinema reenacts the tale of the living statue. The mythical rigidity of the image has been broken, he writes, as the cinematic world unfolds a dream of a gesture. And the famous quotation, "Properly speaking, there are no images but only gestures in cinema." Yesterday, for example, I saw a wonderful reassurances or corroborations of this idea in the presentation in the morning of Professor Xavier in the early cinema capturing gestures and in the reworking of those gestures. So the key notion here being not the image, but the gesture that is captured, that is regained through cinema, and also the gesture of the filmmaker making this film or reworking the material. We also saw a wonderful poetic example of this gesturality of cinema yesterday in the experimental work of Stephen Dwoskin, where gestures of friends were captured, and also the gesture of the filmmaker was also tangible in that film. So not the image, the framing, but this notion of the gesture. So a gesture in self for Agamben is articulated in multiple ways as an agent of in-betweenness, between dance and image, language and pure spectacle, the body as an exhibition of mediality, of being in the medium, and its obliteration by the alienating machinic gaze of the cinematic apparatus, and ultimately as the intersection between life and art. Now, this recovery of the non-cinematic and cinema's various relationships with the real within thinking about cinematic hybridity in the writings of these theorists not only institutes a new kind of border talk, this time between art and non-art, the real and the intermedial, but it is also marked by a strong emphasis on performativity, on what intermediality does. Unlike the metaphors of media trespasses of the first paradigm, which define what intermediality is in an abstract fashion, these relationships are considered here literally as action and interaction, as relations of power and conflict, with the possibility of unearthing tensions that go beyond the realm of media. As Badiou once said, cinema is not a peaceful art. A great contribution to this line of thought is Luciana Gibbs' elaboration of the idea of the politics of impurity, connecting intermediality conceived in terms of impurity and Rancier's politics of dissensus, I quote, which establishes new relations between reality and appearance, multiplying the possibilities of the film medium in a polemical way while challenging its own limits and power of representation. The disruptive way in which intermedial relations are enacted in cinema are perhaps most explicitly spelled out by Raymond Bellour, whose key concept of entrimage, or images in between, unfolds a vision of in-betweenness in which forms are hollowed out from within or irrigated by the new forces that surround it. There are fissures, interventions, intrusions, collusions, corruptions. Speaking about an explosion of cinema into other forms of moving images, Bellour shifts the discourse on in-betweenness from media as a system of signs, similarly to Badiou or Rancière, to the more palpable framework of the dispositives in which they are experienced, and where again he sees in-betweenness in terms of multiplication, tension, and as the title of his more recent book indicates, the battle of the dispositives. I will stop here this brief and unavoidably incomplete overview of some of the central questions regarding the state of the art in what can be defined as a broadly inclusive area of intermediality studies. And as an homage to Dick Higgins's famous intermedia chart, consisting, you all know this chart, of concentric and overlapping circles, I took the liberty of doodling a similarly bubbly chart to sum up these three major paradigms. So A, the media trespasses, B, the contact zones mapped through post-structuralist philosophies, and C, rethinking in-betweenness. What is important to note here is that there is no unified framework, so there's no giant bubble to comprise them all. If we try to assess the research output in these areas, we can say that notwithstanding all the rigor of scientific accuracy, the studies based on transsemiotic border talks, the first paradigm, which make use of a media studies framework without any hybridization with other fields of theoretical inquiry, have so far proved to be rather self-enclosed. Most of them remain within the bounds of meta-theory, working on a classification of intermedial relations. Researches that adhere to the second and third paradigms conceive intermediality in terms of a multiple in-betweenness and open up new avenues by acknowledging the need for a perspective of in-betweenness as well. They result in a less unified but more productive lines of inquiries that seek out new interdisciplinary vantage points, also at the level of methodologies. The intersection of these latter two paradigms is also where our own recently concluded research project on Eastern European cinema can be positioned. So there is no possibility of summing up our own results in detail here, so I will merely focus on two questions. One, what intermediality has revealed to us about contemporary Eastern European cinema, and two, from a reverse angle, what these films have revealed about new directions in intermediality. Now, regarding the first question, I will only mention some of the areas where we found that figurations of intermediality have significantly shaped the aesthetic of contemporary Eastern European cinema. So these are tableau compositions, for example, and fine art references used in narratives often comprising situations of extreme crisis as figurations of melancholia and reflections upon the relationship of body and image, viscerality and aestheticization, life and art. We have a recent textbook example of this in Radu Jude's film, Scarred Hearts, if you've seen that film. If not, then here are only these two pictures. Now, addressing acute political, social, or psychological issues indirectly through an interweaving of allegorization, intermedial figuration, and a strong emphasis again on the body, the senses, and the gaze. Two very different examples. Pawlikowski's Ida with photographic poetry of the images which convey how the hero is caught in the web of history, identity, and sensations, or the visceral allegory of history in Palfi's Taxidermia. We have meditations upon history and time, cultural and personal identity through revitalizing archive imagery, including art and cinephile quotations and earlier alternative narrative forms of moving images, along with the power of photographic stillness or painterly artifice, forging a visual language of increased hybridity and plasticity. So in all of these, intermediality is seldom, if ever, deployed solely as art for art's sake, aestheticism, or experimentation. Instead, it is always raising questions to which there are no easy answers in connection with history, identity, and post-communist reality through a perspective lodged in between personal experience and reflexive detachment. And now this is what highlights for me the relevance of the third paradigm outlined earlier, and the way in which within an already expanded field of intermediality studies under the horizon of post-structuralism, the focus on the interlocking of the real and the intermedial becomes essential in understanding the intermediality of recent Eastern European films. Furthermore, this is the standpoint from where we also observe through the examples that we see here, important changes regarding the strategies of intermediality in contemporary cinema. Now, in order to outline some of these changes, I would like to go back to Bellure and his metaphor of the double helix, borrowed from molecular biology in an article written originally for the catalogue of the landmark exhibition, Passages of the Image, which was one of the first exhibitions to combine photography, film, and video installation. And through the complex model of the double helix, Bellure, in fact, unpacks further his concept of the images in between. Images in the digital age, he writes, are not only ubiquitous, but ever harder to define as things in themselves. We experience them more in terms of passages of the image, where the ambiguous preposition of includes not only the sense of in between the images, but also the viewers passing in front of the image and more obscure connection of what is missing from the image or to what contains it, a passage, as the motto chosen by Bellure from Henri Michaud's poem indicates, from one mist to one flesh. Furthermore, moving images combine embodied and disembodied experience, reality and artificiality, sensation and codes through the double helix structure, intertwining two forms of analogy, which are constantly threatened and refashioned. The photographic reproduction of the real, the analogy based on natural vision, and the mechanical reproduction of movement, that is the way the apparatus creates its own visible world. Although in principle this structure applies to all visual media, its complexity is enhanced in cinema, he says, because of a pattern of possibilities established, formed by the overlappings and passages that are capable of operating between the different arts. Now, extending the metaphor to another level and taking into account the import of all the other recent theorizations, we may perhaps consider the inter-art and intermedia connections and analogies on the one hand, and the power of the cinematic image to resemble, represent, and to establish various passageways to the real in all its possible interpretations on the other, as two sets of relations comprising the domains of art and non-art joined in a similar double helix. On both sides, there are further interrelationships at play, yet they are constantly interlocked. Intermediality operates in this way like the DNA of cinema, connecting the old with the new in heritage forms, patterns, conventions with technological and aesthetic innovations and mutations. Seen in an inalienable conjunction with the real, it weaves the fabric of cinema through its passages between the arts and the different technological forms of the moving images. But I would not like to insist much on the metaphor itself. I would merely like to suggest that this is a conjunction where important changes can be seen. And I'm not referring to the obvious areas marked by CGI, where cinema and the arts can converge or diverge along a wide spectrum. I'm referring to a growing strategy to add new dimensions to the relations of in-betweenness in a way that produces a new type of intermediality emerging in contemporary cinema as a whole. In one of my previous essays, I described two basic templates that generate a sense of intermediality within film. Sensual mode, as you all know, that involves a synesthetic perception of the world, and a structural mode that unravels the image into pieces and layers of media representations. Now here I would like to draw the outlines of a possible third one, typical for these days of media convergence, where multiplied interart and real intermedial context zones can be observed. An expansive mode that excessively stretches and skews the cinematic form in the direction of the other arts, at times adding further transmedia extensions to a film, while on the other hand, especially as it is manifested in contemporary Eastern European film, it anchors the cinematic world further into a specific cultural context. To co-opt Rancière's terminology, in such an expansive mode, cinema overflows itself both through the gaps between media and between media and reality. And I would like to exemplify this with a Romanian film made by Cristi Puiu. So what I see as two strategies: contaminated forms, or the format of expanded cinema within cinema. We may see the bridging of gaps between different interrelated and art and media forms through the expansion or folding of one form over the other. This strategy usually operates on the continuous mutual infiltration, contamination between the arts media, between the art and non-art. Now, this was the case, for example, with Porumboi's second game that you may know or may not know, but this is also the case of this film Sierra Nevada, made by Puiu, which is actually, I'm not sure if anyone has seen the film. Yes, good, thank you. So the film is about a family reunion on the occasion of the Orthodox ritual for remembering the dead 40 days after the funeral. The large family is making preparations for the religious ceremony. There's not much piety, but there's plenty of bickering going on. A great feast is being prepared. This is somewhat, however, absurdly delayed. According to the intentions of the director, the film presents the family gathering through the imagined perspective of the dead man, yet this point of view is never actually articulated in the film, in which it is only the spectator who is in the position of watching through the mobile eyes of the camera, moving closely around the people as an invisible guest. With more than a dozen characters paraded in front of us, the film paints a contemporary fresco of the human comedy of family relations. In accordance with Agamben's iconoclastic vision of cinema, the absence of the dead father and the absence of genuine mourning is filled with a rich choreography of everyday gestures in a truly gestural cinema that renounces classical dramaturgy for fluctuations in tensions, endlessly repeated acts of comings and goings from one room to another, doors opening and closing, people entangled in petty arguments, etc. All within an overcrowded apartment in Bucharest. Now, stretched over 173 minutes, the film challenges the attention span of the viewer, who gets immersed in this way, not so much in a story, but in a world, in a sensuous universe of voices, gesticulating bodies, moving in and out of the dark hallway in the cluttered rooms. Gesturality prevails over the image in every aspect of these box-like spaces in which paintings, mirrors superimposed with the photographs and holy icons, or reveal gestures of peoples having placed them there. Even the first images which may struck us with pictoriality, present gestures of human intervention within this world. And although the film may be seen as a hilariously deadpan post-communist variation on thematic or stylistic elements borrowed from the cinema of Louis Buñuel, Cassavetes, or Éric Rohmer, its strength resides in its stretched out quasi-real-time format, making the viewer part of an experience resembling something in between reality TV and the newest vogue of site-specific theater, in which plays are staged within the confined space of people's homes, thus making the audience literally go through the performances and bleeding art or artifice directly into the perception of reality and vice versa. Now, in such a heavily contaminated cinema with theatricality on the one hand and everydayness on the other, it is surprising to see how the same art references pop up as we saw in films conceived in a more static and aestheticized tableau style. Mantegna's Dead Christ, for example, or Michelangelo's Pietà are evoked in two scenes by the postures of the protagonists. It is only a hint, a fleeting impression that lingers over the image or passes through, exemplifying what Badiou describes as the visitation of the idea in cinema, like a passage of grace coming through the transparent veil of the images. Now, despite its degree of incorporation, the reference highlights the Europeanness of Eastern European cinemas, which is both reaffirmed as a myth and questioned, ironically, time and again through such vague allusions to masterpieces of European art. Now, while similar images that we encounter, yes, I'm at the end, throughout the global cinema, we see an example here in Ridley Scott's Alien, Covenant, are used as fairly straightforward devices meant to add a degree of sophistication to the image. These examples of Eastern European cinema are usually much more ambivalent or layered. In this case, for example, they appear side by side to references to Walt Disney costumes, Disney World, and so on. So there's a much more complex framework, which I cannot really elaborate on here. I'm going to skip this part. Lots of people have remarked the absence of Da Vinci's Last Supper reference in the film, which could have been an obvious reference, which actually appears in the poster made for the film, for the foreign distribution of the film. However, we have to be aware that there's another poster designed by the director himself for domestic audiences, and which adds a very meaningful transmedia extension, which brings me to the other aspect of my talk. Strategy, which is this transmedia extensions. So in this mode, we may see connections established across interrelated works conceived in multiple art forms in which one becomes the extension of the other. This mode integrates elements of intermediality with transtextuality. That is, you know what transtextuality is. I'm not going to explain it. So this extension happens most of the times in the direction of installation art. We all know examples of this. One of the latest examples is Béla Tarr's exhibition, where he actually made a short film to include into this installation, which expands the universe of his own films, recent in Amsterdam. Now, in the case of Cristi Puiu, the extension was made in the direction of photography and an exhibition where searching for the image for the poster of the film, the director took hundreds of photographs at the outskirts of Bucharest and exhibited in an art gallery and in a book format where we see how he's moving away from the fictional story into the real world, paradoxically, through these highly aestheticized, peacefully landscapes covered with snow. I'm going to just show you quickly a few photographs here, how these look like. Yes, this is it. So this is an expansive vision that reframes the real from multiple perspectives. So these are my last sentences, don't worry. So they introduce a visible gap, not only between cinema and photography, because the photography exhibition has the same title, Sierra Nevada, as the film, but also it introduces these gaps between, sorry, I lost it here, art and non-art, reality and its aestheticized mediation. So it's the same gap that we see already in the title of the film, the ambivalence of the reference of this misreference to Sierra Nevada, because it does not refer to anything, not to the geographical location, but it introduces an enigma that the reader could not solve. So it is something added to the film manifestation of the gap in the sensible itself. So it demonstrates for us, I think, the title itself in one single word, that how intermedial strategies and these gaps between these things can emerge as interfaces between East and the West, and as such become inscriptions and articulations of a desire for cultural connection and reconnection, while on the other hand they can also stage an effective dissensus regarding the standardization of images. They employ the overflowing excess of the double helix for enrooting current general trends of aesthetic practices, or universally recognizable iconography within the intranslatability of specific local realities, which also means, of course, anxieties. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to just thank you, Luciana, for that lovely introduction, and apologise for not dressing suitably. If only I'd thought of it. And to thank Lucia very much for the invitation, not only to be here, but to be on the advisory board. And I'm certainly learning a lot about how to manage a research project and how to run a conference brilliantly from Lucia. So I might approach you as in a mentoring role for that as well, because I'm not that successful at grant applications, if I'm honest. Anyway, today I am going to talk about the project, obviously, particularly at the end. So it's a kind of presentation of two parts, really. I'm going to talk about my own work and kind of, as Luciana said, the kind of the shifts I've made between different media and cinema as well at the root of that. But I'll talk specifically about what I think of the project at the end. So it's a bit segmented, but I'm sure it'll be okay. And I hope to show a couple of clips if there's time from YouTube, so I'm sorry for not integrating. I'm not very polished at my presentations, haven't integrated my clips. Okay, so in this presentation, I will focus on how Brazil's musical comedy tradition, which we've heard about a lot already in great detail, known as the Chanchada, which emerged in the 1930s and dominated Brazilian film production in the late 40s and throughout the 1950s, how the Chanchada has conversed with, most obviously, popular music and the radio, but also in terms of, intertextuality or intermediality, but also particularly given my recent interests, how it dialogues with the popular review theatre, the Teatro de Revista, Brazil's equivalent of US vaudeville, or what we had in the UK, which was known as music hall tradition. So first of all, to focus on radio and popular song. I won't show this yet. Okay. So Intermedialities, interestingly, because I just got the copy of the book the other day, is the title of a very significant, in terms of size and content, section of the recently published book, The Routledge Companion to Latin American Cinema. And it looks particularly at the intersection of film in Latin America with the other arts and media like photography, the radio, music, television and digital culture. So I apologise that I've drawn on that resource quite widely, particularly the contribution of Ana Lopez in that book, because it just arrived on my desk the other day and I thought perfect timing. So in the section of the book entitled Intermedialities, Ana Lopez writes that in the 1930s, the 1930s represented a decade of, quote, profound intermediality in Latin America, not least between the radio and sound cinema, a period in which old and new media collided, and in which parallel intermedial processes served as the shifting base for the development of the golden age of Latin American national cinemas in the 30s and 40s. That's the end of Anna's quote. Ana Lopez then explores what she terms the broader intermedial horizon, and she questions some of the standard historiographical assumptions through which this period in Latin American film history has been understood. So clearly, intermediality as a method is proving extremely useful, and Lucia's project is at the forefront of that. So to return to the Brazilian musical comedy tradition known as the Chanchada, it's fair to say, as we've already seen, that from the outset, it was an example of a self-consciously intermedial cinema. It grew out of a tradition, and it's not unique at all in terms of national cinemas. I know that, of silent documentary film inspired by the world of popular music, but also by the annual carnival of Rio de Janeiro, where Brazil's film industry was located in the 1930s primarily. So the prototype Chanchada, if you like, was Alô, Alô Carnaval, which I haven't got on here, but Hello, Hello Carnival. So the name says two interesting things. It's got the intersection, the intermediality with carnival, but also Alô, Alô was the way that radio presenters addressed their listeners. So it immediately, from the title of the film, makes obvious this makes self-conscious this intermediality. And it starred a young Carmen Miranda. So again, shamefully drawing on my own work on Carmen, because any excuse to talk about her is a good one. And the film definitively established the paradigms of this Brazilian musical comedy tradition, which came to be known as Chanchada. But this film, Alô, Alô, Hello, Hello Carnival, equally it epitomizes the centrality of dialogues between different art forms and media to our understanding of Brazilian film history and other national cinemas more broadly. So I know some of this is very well known to lots of you, so I apologise, but here we go anyway. So Carmen Miranda, like many of the first film actors in Brazil, was already a very established and well-known star of popular music, and also a radio star in Brazil when she made the transition to the screen. Such early film stars like Carmen Miranda embodied the intermediality of cinema. In 1930, Carmen's recording of the song Para Você Gostar de Mim, So That You'll Like Me, better known as Taí, that's it, was a hit of the year in the carnival, run-up to Carnival, breaking all record sales, and it was the song on everyone's lips during the Carnival celebrations in Rio that year. That success launched Carmen as the most famous female singer in Brazil at just the tender age of 21. By the end of the 1930s, she had recorded almost 300 records in Brazil. So she was a star vocal performer, well received not only on the radio, but at music festivals, live performances. She was invited to perform for the leading radio stations in Brazil, in Rio, and in 1934 she was elected the Queen of Broadcasting in Rio de Janeiro, a competition held by a local newspaper. The previous year, 33, she had also won a national competition that allowed her to visit Argentina as Brazil's official ambassador of samba. From April 1932, she had her own 15-minute slot on the, and I should have checked how to pronounce this. Is it Meirink Vega? Meirinki Vega. I think it's a Dutch. Is that right? I think it was a Dutch family. Anyway, so the most influential broadcaster of the early 1930s. She was the first performer to be given a contract by a radio station, as opposed to being paid per performance. And she became a regular fixture in the 1930s on the Programa Casé, which was Brazil's first radio showcase for live performances by the stars of popular music. So Carmen clearly participated very actively in Brazilian radio star system in the 1930s, a star system and a radio which was actively promoted by the president, the regime of President Getúlio Vargas, as part of a wider campaign to construct a national consciousness or a sense of what this neologism of Brasilidade or Brazilianness, which was very firmly rooted in popular culture, particularly the sort of music culture of Rio as well. So this undeniably made Carmen aware of the centrality of Rio's popular culture to her success and her star persona, but especially Rio's popular music. But her greatest ambition remained to become a film star. And there's lots of evidence that she wrote to some of the cinema magazines, sent photographs of herself to try and create a star text even before she'd appeared in any films. She wasn't the only one, but she was very active in this self-promotion. So this resounding success that she had in the record industry and on the radio guaranteed her a place in Brazil's first sound films. But I argue in the BFI book that really that even before she became an actress, she sang like an actress, if you like, by which I mean that she performed her songs by all accounts and with a exaggerated sort of theatricality. So she lengthened the notes of songs for effect, often comic. She incorporated facial expressions and expansive, as I think I've inherited, expansive hand movements from into her performances. And in her live vocal performances, she was often known, she loved swear words, she was quite inventive, but she would often introduce rather risque, witty asides or interjections. She loved songs with humorous lyrics that allowed her to give free rein to her natural comic skills, which we see evidenced in her Hollywood performances. But she clearly loved this exaggeration and this kind of so she had this ready-made kind of performance style which made the transition to the screen very smooth. She wasn't blessed with a vast vocal range, so she relied heavily on theatricality when singing, playing with the sounds of language, which we see in her Hollywood performances as well. Language, particularly between different languages in Hollywood. She used a lot of Portuguese in her performances as well. But obviously for that, there's kind of sonic potential of a lot of that because it wasn't understandable to US audiences. And she often introduces in the films as well in Hollywood these kind of interjections into her lyrics. And we all know about her kind of visual gestures, smiles, hand movements, exaggerated expressions, and so on. So, if I move on to talk about the film on the left there, Hello, Hello, Allo, Allo, Brazil. So this came before the kind of prototype Chanchada, but it has many elements of it. And it was, again, it used this title to immediately engage with the radio, allo, allo, hello, hello, the greeting of radio presenters. So this was also the film in which Carmen Miranda made her first screen performance. Actually, I'm not sure that's right, but anyway, one of her first screen performances. I think there's some documentary footage of her in some earlier film, A Voz do Carnaval, yeah, 33. So anyway, in this film, she appears amid scenes of carnival in Rio and shots of the city. But the plot, like many of these early films, is centred on the radio. So it's a backstage plot. We have a young man from the countryside who comes to the big city of Rio in search of his favourite female star. This film also included a selection of hit songs performed by many of the biggest names from the world of radio. So it has this ready-made audience appeal, and the poster kind of calls on that as well. It foregrounds very much, the film posters foreground the musical stars. Even the songs sometimes are given prominence in posters. Radio stations in Brazil, in Rio as particularly, already allowed live audiences to watch live broadcasts and also talent competitions. So there was already a ready-made cinema audience via the radio as well, who were very eager to go and see their icons and their idols on screen. The fact that Carmen was a star of radio and music was reflected in the fact that she was chosen to perform the finale, the musical finale of Hello, Hello, Brazil, which was the carnival march, Primavera no Rio, Springtime in Rio. Her box office appeal as a star of the radio was equally reflected in her star billing on film posters. We have a couple of example here where she's given 2 photos. She also appeared in a very large poster of an image of her on the facade of the Alhambra Cinema in Rio, where the film premiered in February. and it remained in exhibition for 3 weeks. So her next film role was in the other film on the right-hand side, Students, 1935, another musical, but this time not related to Carnival, but rather related to the popular June festivals in Brazil, the Festas Juninas. So the plot is set on this idyllic university campus during these June popular Catholic festivals. But yet again, the plot is a pretext, first and foremost, for including a range of hit musical numbers. Again, in this case, 9 in total. This was actually Carmen's only narrative role in a Brazilian film. So usually she was just restricted to the musical numbers. In the film, Carmen Miranda plays Mimi, a young radio singer who falls in love with a student, hence the university connection, played by the well-known male singer, her almost kind of one of her male counterparts in terms of radio and recording, Mario Reis. So to return to Hello, Hello, Carnaval, Hello, Hello, Carnival, she appeared in the film alongside her sister Aurora, who was also a well-known singer and radio star. And this roll call of stars from the world of radio and popular music. So the poster itself is very, it reflects very clearly how central stardom from radio music was to promoting the film. The other thing that I found interesting is the way that the film, in terms of timing, when the film was made. So most of the cast were working very actively on the radio at the same time. So the shooting of the film generally took place in the early hours of the morning after the radio commitments had ended for the day. And there was very minimal rehearsal time since the filming began in October for a January release in time for the run-up to Carnival. Once again, it's a backstage plot. It's set in the backdrop is the Rio Carnival, obviously, the celebrations, and it hinges on two male characters, kind of malandro-type spivs or hustlers, who are trying to convince a show business impresario to stage one of their review shows. So again, we've got the intermediality with the Teatro de Revista in many ways in this film. They approach the owner of the comically named Blue Fly Casino. So there's a kind of engagement with the kind of upscale world of the casinos of Rio, which I'm going to talk about later. And it's this kind of slightly kind of irreverent treatment of that much more upper middle class elite world by calling it the Blue Fly Casino. The backstage plot provided a pretext for including 23 musical numbers. And João Luís Vieira has argued that this film and Hello, Hello, Brazil, its predecessor, functioned, quote, as a sort of visualized radio, which I think is a really interesting way of looking at it. And he adds that, the added bonus for the audience was that they got this added visual pleasure of seeing the bodies of their radio stars. And he writes, it was as if, had he closed his eyes, this is again João Luís Vieira's words, the spectator could have been simply sitting in front of a radio. So I just wanted to show a clip which many of you will probably be very familiar with, which is Carmen Miranda and her sister Aurora singing Cantoras do Rádio, a song called Radio Singers. So again, you've got the kind of very self-conscious... Oh, no, hang on. Which might... just trying to get onto... Right, okay. But it's always a good excuse to see this again. I've watched it again this morning. I never tire of it. Oh, is there? Where's that? I've never seen it. Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay. I'm always wary of doing... Ooh. No. Always wary of going straight into YouTube after once when I was giving an undergraduate class. Sometimes it comes up with the advertisements that for things you've been looking at recently. It could have been worse, but it came up as bunion guards for your feet. So I denied all knowledge, but yeah, it was me. So just to be very careful, but I don't look for anything worse than bunion guards. Okay. I had been looking for incontinence pads for my mother earlier in the day, so that would have ruined my reputation. Sorry. Okay. Okay, well, I'll cut them off in their prime, but you can all go away and have a look at that at your leisure. So what we've got there, obviously, they're singing "We Are the Radio Singers." The lyrics of the song are kind of a celebration of the technology of and the span of radio, how it can reach all parts of the nation and so on. So you've obviously got that sort of intermediality being very explicit and drawn on and creatively drawn on, but also I think you've got the world visually. For me, it's more like the film actually is reproducing the sets in the film reproduce the real life Atlântico Casino in Rio. So you've got this another intertext really, which is the world of the casinos that I'll come back to later, which and it's obviously giving people who don't have access to that very sort of privileged space, which was primarily for quite wealthy Brazilians and tourists. So again, I think that's another very creative use of both this kind of matrix of different media there. Okay, so the consolidation of the radio. That's the PowerPoint, sorry. Slick as ever. Right. So the consolidation of the radio as a mass medium coincided historically with the emergence of locally produced sound films in Brazil, as we know, and other parts of Latin America. And I think that Ana Lopez, in the book I mentioned earlier, she talks about how this is very different to the US, where radio was already much more established as a mass medium by the late 1920s. So Ana Lopez really argues that this temporal coincidence in Latin America is significant for two very different reasons. Firstly, it means that the chronology of the massification of the two media, the radio and the cinema, follows a much more intermedial path than was the case in other countries, perhaps, where you didn't have this chronological coincidence. So something I think for us to think about. But secondly, she also argues that the emergence of national styles or idioms occurs simultaneously in Latin American countries and in Brazil particularly, in the radio and in the cinema. So in the case of Brazil, the record industry and the radio are promoting samba as a national rhythm. And obviously that's happening at the same time in the cinema as well. So again, I think food for thought, really. And as we see, obviously music is the kind of raison d'etre for the nation's first sound films in Brazil. So I don't think it's any coincidence that the kind of gramophone industry, the phonographic industry and the radio, everything's sort of booming at the same time. That's why we call it this kind of golden age of popular culture in Brazil. So the two media, radio and sound cinema, obviously complemented each other very conveniently. And I think something that we could explore further, and something that really interests me, is how this coincidence, how that affects the audiences and their ability to listen and to watch, and their kind of sensorial responses as well. I think that's something that their competence, really, how do they understand, they make use of one medium in order to understand another, and what perhaps that gives in terms of enriching their experience of early cinema as well. So again, to go back to what Ana Lopez has written, she says that popular rhythms are the engine that drove radio as well as early sound cinema in Latin America, establishing an exciting and complex synergy that defined the national as modern and incipient, and their own singularity, national imaginaries and mass audiences. In early sound cinema, the centrality of music is most evident, not only because of its presence in the soundtrack, but because it is above all visibly performed and ostensibly experienced live. And I thought that was a particularly, I should have put that bit in bold, didn't, at the bottom on the left there. I thought that was particularly interesting and something that it's made me sort of think about that a bit, a lot more. She says, it's not surprising, therefore, that every national cinema explored within Latin America and exploited the representation of musicality by seeking recourse to radio station settings and stories and performers who were becoming media stars through their exposure through radio and recorded music. And I thought the last part of the quote was interesting. Many of these films function to provide what the invisibility of radio precluded, the image of the singing body and the visual restaging of the moment of radio performance. So I think there's a lot more that could be teased out of that. So I'd now like to turn my attention, the pictures are the best bits, so I'll save those. I'd now like to turn my attention to the interplay of Brazilian cinema, popular cinema, the Chanchada particularly, and this theatrical tradition known as Teatro de Revista that Luciana spoke so well about the other day and provided a great, I don't have to say a lot of things that I was going to say. I think it's important to underline that the different art forms and the diverse media that early Brazilian cinema drew on were equally receptive, as has been made clear in Luciana's presentation and Flavia's as well. These art forms were equally receptive to ideas taken from the cinema and the nascent medium of film, especially Hollywood imports, as you showed the other day. And the intermediality was always a kind of relationship of dialogue and mutual influence. Obviously, and again, I know Luciana talked about this, the arrival of the movies in Brazil was initially seen as a threat to the theatre, quite obviously, particularly to the commercial survival of the more lowbrow, popular theatre of Rio. But ironically, the 1920s, and through various strategies that you show in your work, Luciana, theatre and cinema learnt very quickly how to coexist and sort of self-promote. So it proved to be a boom time for the Teatro de Revista, and they found ways to mutually promote their work. So I'm very grateful to Luciana's innovative work on this, which I'll come back to later on. So in the mid-1920s, Rio's cinema theatres combined film screenings with the performance of short plays and the prologues that Luciana talks about. But I think that Hollywood's greatest impact on the Teatro de Revista in this era was in the realm of music and choreography. US musical genre like the foxtrot, ragtime, the shimmy, the charleston, jazz, as well as tap dancing, became very commonplace in the revue theatre in Brazil in the 20s. And by the end of the decade, it was not unusual for entire revues to be inspired by Hollywood film. as we've seen. In addition to this, there are numerous examples of individual sketches or quadros within a review which engage with Hollywood or musical numbers that do so. So these imported North American music styles and dance genre were not only performed in the reviews, but they also were discussed in the kind of script, often made fun of as well, in a kind of irreverent attitude towards Hollywood. Tap dancing via the Teatro de Revista became so commonplace that the Rio press, if you look at the 20s, is full of adverts for dance schools that are offering tap dancing lessons, for example. So that's just one. The Teatro de Revista continued to play a major role, obviously, in promoting local music as well, the choro, the machixe, but especially carnival, samba, and the marchinha, the carnival marches as well. But throughout the 20s, these Brazilian musical genre were increasingly rubbing shoulders with an eclectic mix of foreign rhythms, not only North American. So I just want to mention I haven't gained access to the wonderful archive of Pascoal Segreto, his theatrical company, but I'm using the work of Tiago Gomes de Melo, and he provides some really interesting statistics. So this was an archive that a man who was a kind of impresario who owned lots of theatres where these reviews were performed, and evidence from his archive shows that there's a dominant presence in those reviews of North American music. So just to give you a few facts and figures, of 530 pieces of music performed in his reviews, the most common genre was actually the foxtrot, 160 examples, followed by the samba, but much lower, 87, the carnival march, 83. Of the total number of songs performed, musical numbers, there were 226 examples of Brazilian genre, as opposed to not that many, less, 201 North American ones, 78 European, and 25 from other parts of Latin America. So we can see that there's a very evident coexistence of imported and domestic rhythms and dance styles. And these often gave rise to quite interesting hybrids that I would have loved to have seen performed, like Aracy Cortes' performance of the Samba Black Bottom in 1927 in one of her theatrical reviews. So in my research for the book that's coming out, a bit of a gratuitous plug, but with the University of Texas in January, I looked particularly at racialized performance in Rio at the turn of the century up to about 1950. And I was doing some research in the SEDOC Funarte archive in Rio. And I came across these, what I think are fascinating photographs from theatrical reviews from the 1920s and from 1930, where we see that Brazilian performers were clearly experimenting with some of the traditions of blackface minstrelsy from the US. And there are some examples, some references to this. On the left, we've got João Martins, and I'll come back to that review, which was written by Odovaldo Viana. Interestingly, so a lot, anybody who's spotted these kind of examples of blackface minstrelsy before have said, well, Odovaldo Viana, he went to New York, I think now, the previous year, and he was clearly inspired by performances that he saw in New York. But I think there's much obviously a kind of link with cinema here, and the films of Al Jolson in particular. Okay, we think about Al Jolson's performance in The Jazz Singer in blackface, 1927, which was a huge hit in Brazil. Jolson's third film, Say It With Songs, 1929, also shown in Brazil, he didn't actually appear in blackface, but I don't think it's any coincidence that the title of this review, where we've got blackface performance, is the title of that film in which Jolson appears. So Odovaldo Viana is clearly familiar with his work, and he's experimenting with some of these performance tropes as well. And on the right-hand side, we've got, this is actually much earlier. So this performance of blackface in Odovaldo Viana's work in 1930 is often said to be the first, but there are clearly earlier examples This one as well, 1929. Again, if you look closely, you've clearly got the kind of exaggerated makeup of the minstrelsy tradition. And I could talk a bit more about different types of black or brown-faced performance in Brazilian theatre, but that would be too distracting. But there obviously was a tradition of homegrown, we could call it blackface, but this is very clearly engaging with the minstrelsy tradition. So it's an imported borrowing from this performance tradition. So I won't get too distracted. I think I'm going to run out of time otherwise if I talk about that, but I can if you're interested at the end. So, of course, many of Brazil's first film stars also began their entertainment career in the revue theatre. So we've got these kind of intermedial figures in Brazil's early sound cinema, which clearly evoke for audiences the world of theatre, and circus in some cases as well as the radio. So a case in point is the most famous comic double act in Brazilian film history, Oscarito and Grande Otelo, who obviously became synonymous with their work for the Atlântida studios in the Chanchadas of the 50s. But Oscarito, first of all, a very versatile actor, had a family background in the circus, the radio and revue theatre. Here on the left, we've got the cast of a revue, Calma Gege, which Gege was a nickname for Getúlio Vargas, so it's like calm down Getúlio, the president. And it's interesting that in this revue, Oscarito actually imitates, he does a parody of Getúlio Vargas, and we probably are much more familiar with 22 years later when he performs this comic parody of Vargas again in the Chanchada, Nem Sansão, Nem Dalila, neither Samson nor Delilah, which is a self-conscious parody of Cecil B. DeMille's film Samson and Delilah, obviously. So again, we've got this delicious, I think, intertextual reference there that kind of harks back to his intermedial kind of his work in other media, here the Teatro de Revista. So Grande Otelo, very well known, and we've heard about him helpfully yesterday as well. I think I'm surprised by how many people are not aware that he had a career as a child star in Brazil, in the Teatro de Revista. And subsequently, I'll mention a bit later, I put these slides in yesterday because we were talking about Josephine Baker, so I've added a few slides of her at the performing with him. So he actually performed, he travelled to Rio as a child with the Companhia Negra de Revistas, the black review company, it translates as Brazil's first all-black theatrical company, which performed theatrical reviews. And he was very well received. As we see on the left there, we've got this newspaper review of his performance at 6 years old. There's some confusion about his age, but he was very young. So this child star, and interestingly, I think very clearly, the review company is borrowing this tradition of child stars from kind of US tradition as well, particularly of Afro-American children in some of the companies that Brazilians were familiar with that toured in Brazil. Little Esther, I think, was one example. I've talked quite a lot in my book about those kind of transnational dialogues between revue theatre in the States as well. So as a result of his popularity, he really became one of the stars of the Companhia Negra de Revista. I'll skip a little bit there. And obviously, he makes the transition to film, most famously as part of this double act. And again, I think it was mentioned yesterday, this example of a chanchada from Atlântida, a dupla do barulho, which I think João Luís translated for the Stars book as the terrible twosome, which kind of works quite well, which is actually based on Oscarito and Grande Otelo's earlier career in popular theatre, travelling Brazil, and it very clearly makes this point that was mentioned yesterday that, Grande Otelo was treated as a kind of second rate in terms of billing and so on because of his racial ancestry. Yeah, stop or sum up. Yeah, okay, that's fine. So have I got, how many minutes, if you tell me how many minutes I can have, 5. Can I then talk about the project separately? Okay, okay. So obviously, I wanted to talk really about the figure of the baiana in the Teatro de Revista. So this was a very common performance trope. The baiana traditionally, based on real-life Afro-Brazilian women, street vendors, during the colonial period and beyond, but it was a very common figure, stock type really, within the Teatro de Revista to have a white woman playing the baiana. So throughout the early 1920s particularly, you've got white women performing as baianas in the Teatro de Revista. The first exception really was Araújo, who you've got on the right there, who had mixed race ancestry. So she had some Afro-Brazilian ancestry, but she kind of could pass. She was known as the mulata asumida, so her kind of white, she had, I think, a Spanish father, allowed her to kind of be the first woman who wasn't white, but she could perform blackness from in a non-threatening way because of her partial whiteness as well. And we know, helpfully, John mentioned yesterday that Ella Moten also in Flying Down to Rio performs this baiana archetype. So the baiana really kind of transits between not only the theatre and the cinema in Brazil, because we've got obviously Carmen Miranda's very famous performance in the film Banana of the Land, Banana da Terra, of what is it about the baiana, o que é que a baiana tem. And she really makes, obviously we know, she makes the costume her own in Hollywood. Exaggerating, you know, the turban, the idea of the fruit on the tray becomes the fruit on the hat, and so on. So I was kind of interested in how the baiana, in a way, is a kind of intermedial trope or an intermedial figure. So she's not only kind of moving back into between popular theatre, real life, if you like, as another medium, and cinema, but also the casino world. So here we've got Josephine Baker performing not long after Carmen Miranda's film was released, so clearly taking her inspiration from the film Banana of the Land and learning Portuguese and performing. What I found interesting though are these sketches of possible costumes. So we've got, I think, Josephine Baker, because of her ethnicity, to me that doesn't look much like a baiana costume. It's more like a kind of nun's wimple. You know, it's kind of a very chaste costume as compared with the more obvious Miranda with the bare midriff. But it looks like when she actually went on stage, she had a kind of mixture of the two. So I can come back to that. And I think in terms of intermediality, I kind of wanted to sort of pose the question really about how do we treat Hollywood? Because in the chanchadas of the 50s in Brazil, we've got, again, the baiana is a very common figure in the musical numbers, often played by Eliana Macedo, who we've heard about before. So where does that baiana fit in? You know, it's kind of mediated, it's coming from the theatrical world, from the Teatro de Revista, but it's kind of being reflected back from Hollywood as well, because these performances are clearly much more reminiscent of the Hollywood performances, particularly by Carmen, but also by Aurora Miranda, and these kind of B-movie, what I call B-movie baianas, the kind of other studios came up with Miranda wannabes, really. And they, to me, are much more reminiscent of what we see reflected back in the Chanchada. So it's like Brazilian cinema is looking to Hollywood for its own ideas about self-definition. And there's one amazing example that these costumes from that night in Rio, when the film was shown in Brazil, the Rio Carnival organisation of that year, they actually wrote to the 20th Century Fox Studios asking for ideas about how can we represent ourselves in the processions, any ideas for sketches and costumes. So you've got this amazing play of mirrors, really. I was going to talk just finally about how do we treat Hollywood? Is that another medium? I think what Ana Lopez suggests in the Routledge Companion to Latin American Cinema is that we haven't just got this matrix of radio, popular music, Brazilian cinema, but we've got Hollywood in there as well. So do we treat that? And I was going to kind of come back to that maybe in the discussion about how whether that it's an intertext quite clearly, but does intermediality help us understand that relationship in any useful way? So I'll stop there. Apologies for running on.
To that movement is that we actually shift out of a filmic context, that we move into a videographic context, or we move into a photographic context, or we move more, in his more recent work, into a gallery context. And this is quite important because if intermedial studies is simply the tracing of allusions to theatre or the allusions to painting in films, then it really just is another expansion of the analysis of filmic style. So what my question to you is, what are you trying to do at the end of your paper by looking at those photographs and by marking the shift from that film to the photographic exhibitions accompanying the film?
I agree with you perfectly, the first part, what you said. So this was my point exactly why I brought in Ballure, that intermediality in this third paradigm, the theory of intermediality is not about solely relations between different media. It's also about diversity relations of arts and media and the real. So all these theories that I talked about, so both, so all of them, Badiou, Rancière, Agamben, in their own way, and Ballure speak about these relations between cinema and art and non-art. So domains of in-betweenness, not covered by intermediality studies before that. So that was my point in applying Ballure's ideas. And unfortunately, I extended my paper a bit too long, and I had to cut short my argument about this relationship. So of film and this particular example, but this was only a particular example to show a certain type of intermediality that I'm sure everybody has observed. There have been already written papers about this, how in contemporary cinema, and I'm not talking about these other cinemas that Ballure names that have popped up through the appearance of a digital image, so installation art, artist cinemas, gallery cinemas, and so on. But so I try to exemplify with this Romanian film that there's a certain kind of extension of an expansive type of intermediality, so to speak, in which expanded cinema appears within cinema. So a fiction film that is contaminated, to use Badiou's word, by other sometimes non-artistic forms. So, and also the other type is when new forms of art are added as extensions to the work. So these are not adaptations, because sometimes we could work on different typologies here. So we could say that there are certain types of adaptations now of adapting part of a fiction film into an installation work, for example, and exhibiting it in a gallery. But I'm not talking about this type. I'm talking about the type where the same author creates an installation, for example, which is clearly related to his cinematic oeuvre. And there's a gap in media, in lots of different aspects between the film and this one. And this was a very obvious example because if anyone has seen the film, this is a film about a family. So we are amidst the family squabbles, and then we have, with the exact same title, an exhibition showing us the outskirts of Bucharest in winter.
So what happens in the gap? That's my question.
Well, what happens in the gap, I think it's exactly this very strange relationship between art and non-art, between reality and its artistic representation, its aestheticized representation. Because, for example, the film is a fiction film. So it's, we can say that it was autobiographically inspired, but we have clearly a fiction film set in an Eastern European apartment. So we get immersed into a fiction film there, so and immersed into a personal space of a fictional family. So very interesting relationship between personal, between real and the fictional, the artificial, because it is also highly artificial, of course. It's like these immersive theatrical experiences. So it could be staged like a theater play anytime, like a site-specific theater, anytime restaged, for example. And then these photographs, which are highly stylized, which are highly, they are like paintings. You saw like brush strokes on a canvas, simple, minimalistic, beautiful photographs are depicting actually the real locations of Bucharest. So this is not fiction. This is photography, framing, reframing the real in an aestheticized form, but also it is highly personal for the director, who seeks through these photographs an adequate image for his film. And also there's a background story that we should know what these outskirts are. For example, is it here? Maybe it's here.
I think it's here.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's here.
Okay.
It's also on this laptop. I can show you. The image that I used for the first, could you find me? And the last of my slides. So that image of a frozen lake. That frozen lake is outside Bucharest, and it is an artificial dam and an artificial lake built during communist times, where also parts of Bucharest was demolished and flooded, and an old cemetery was moved. So for Pethő, this is an image of mourning, actually, of mourning of a past.
I think it was in a thin drive.
Because it was inside.
Okay,
on
never
here?
mind, never mind.
It's in your camera.
Okay.
Never mind, it's not so important. So you remember. So that image that which you used for the poster art is actually highly personal. For us, it strikes us as a beautiful composition, calm, serenity, whiteness, winter maybe. But it is also so these two, so there's a gap, of course, because there's no clear relationship between the film, the topic of the film and the topic of the photographs. But the author reframes reality in such a paradoxical way. So the personal appears through these highly impersonal and stylized photographs much more paradoxically much more directly than through the film, which supposedly presents these intimate relationships of fictional characters, where we have this voyeuristic impression. We are like in a reality TV show, so we see everything that they talk about. We go after them,
Lucia?
No, I just wanted to say how wonderful this panel is, because it addresses the two main strands of our project. One that investigates the applicability of intermediality as a historiographic method applicable in general to all kinds of cinema and cinematic enterprises, and the other one that focuses more pointedly on Brazilian cinema. And I think they complement themselves so beautifully. So thank you very much indeed, the two of you. But I have a question for Lisa. Seeing those clips that you showed and which are so visually so striking, also because of the background painting, the set,
The art deck, yeah.
the set design that seems so influenced by expressionism and all these buildings in the back. The first images of Araújo Carnaval, it's instruments that have been chopped up and kind of
Cute.
anthropomorphized. But also the other clip, Cantores do Rádio, has that city in the background, and the buildings are kind of collapsing.
Oh, the minstrels, the kind of blackface.
Oh,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So that again, the city is acquiring a kind of human characteristic of dynamism and movement, very much in the sense of the things that we used to see in the expressionistic cinema. That was probably being shown in Brazil for another kind of audience in those days, and probably inspired the people who were painting those very stylized sets in those days. I don't know, Luciana might have a view.
I think that's a really interesting. I mean, I think that you could look at the set design between the Teatro de Revista and film. That would be. I don't know if you've done that or anybody else has, but it would be a really interesting.
The settings are by J. Carlos.
Yeah,
The artist is J. Carlos.
who's a famous cartoonist.
Yes.
Yeah, so
He was a genius. And
that was the Cantores do Rádio one. The other set, I don't know.
That links back to your question about Hollywood. That is such a prominent influence here in terms of the music, radio, the setting, the style of the songs, that conversation that goes back and forth and so on. But there was another dialogue with Europe, and the kind of aesthetics that was being cultivated in that time that might have influenced, and we know that there were all these more intellectualized film critics of the time who were writing, perhaps a bit later, on the silent cinema that they loved, Murnau and the German expressionistic cinema. So I don't know how they were conversing. So there was a popular kind of strand. There was a more kind of elitist cinema that was very clearly against sound in the cinema. Was quite militant about that. So I don't know.
Lisa.
I was wanted to. It just made me think. Thanks for that, because this is quite an interesting image. It's because you've got, if you actually look closely at it, you've got skyscrapers. So it seems to me that it's kind of evoking Broadway, or maybe Metropolis, but also
Metropolis is based on New York. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, it was inspired by the landscape of New York.
But then if you look at the signage, it's Mangueira. So it's kind of this hybrid of I think, but yeah, and there's some French. Obviously, there's the French. Sorry.
Flavia.
Yeah, but this is a 99
Setting.
setting, but you can see the style going from the 40s and the 50s. So there is something that goes under. And I was thinking also about Ziegfeld Follies. Ziegfeld Follies is theater that was absorbed by Hollywood, that was absorbed by our reviews. So this circulation, I think it's not only a circulation in the determined period, but over the time, it's a practice. So this kind of scenery, Walter Pinto in the 50s, he used to do this style, and he had different styles for infants, for ladies, so he mixed all this, talking to the past, talking to Ziegfeld Follies, talking to Hollywood. I had a slide of he imitating Ziegfeld Follies in Hollywood, read by Arthur Freed in Easter Parade, but his girls were naked. So that was the difference. But there is something that circulates.
Yeah, that
But I guess
the naked ballerina that you showed in your slide. Yes.
There are many others.
Yeah, amazing. But that is in Metropolis.
Yes.
Fritz Lang.
Yes.
The evil Maria in Fritz Lang's film. She has a famous dance that she is bare chest.
Yeah, but
around.
like with a Germanic style.
Yeah, but she is compared to the prostitute at that point, you know, and that's why she's playing like that, because the saintly Maria is dressed up to the neck and all that.
But
so
I think the circulation was very, very wide. So, for instance, this kind of setting reminds me a lot of the first North American sound films, the Fox Movietons of 1929. And those kind of settings remind me a lot of them. And also, Brazil in the 20s was very influenced by France and Europe. It was not a highbrow thing. It was very popular.
Yeah.
We see in Teatro de Revistas many French characters and people mocking about the French accent.
Yeah, and a lot of some playwrights went to France, didn't they? But also you've got the kind of French companies like the Bataclan. You've got coming to Rio particularly, and the cast are kind of some of the French cast go and work with Portuguese visiting companies as well. So you've got this constant kind of dialogue going on between all these different sort of transnational connections. But I think you're right, Flavia. That's not peculiar to this era. It's continual, into the 50s at least. Bob?
It's such a key point that this is trilateral circulation of North America, South America, and France. And people from Harlem, like Jesse Baker, would meet the Oitu Batutas. So you're having these convergences, and we can't make this unilateral. It's transdirectional, it's multidirectional. So I think circulation really key.
Yeah, and I think Lisa addresses in a fantastic way in her article on Teatro de Revista exactly that kind of circulation that you mentioned and you
Well, that's kind of that was the kind of starting point of the book that I've just finished, because I think that's probably the thing that's not been looked at enough really. But one thing that reminded me of this photo on the right, the script of the review. These are called the Sete Batutas. I think there are other 7. So it's clearly. So the Oito Batutas went to Paris 2 years before this. So again, you've got this movement, this circulation back and to, and sometimes it's kind of lampooned, it's parodied, and then it's mixed with this kind of minstrelsy tradition here. So it's a constant sort of waves. And
It's kind of pop cubism, where the proportions around proportion, the piano, this kind of jazzistic feeling. And so you have all this musicality that's this diasporic, circum-Atlantic kind of performance. Also, in terms of child starring, Sammy Davis Jr. at age 8 did one of these music videos where he performed the role as Rufus Jones, who runs for president, and he becomes president. And because it is a dream, it's a fantasy, but it's kind of predictive of Barack Obama becoming president. And then you think Gonzalo is parallel. Also, you have Jack Benny in Rochester as the black-white comic duo. So these constant analogies in different cultures.
I think we have time for one more question. Sorry. Thank you. We have time for one more question.
if there isn't a question, maybe could I just say something about the project? Because
Yes,
I would
please.
love to.
It would be great.
No, because
And if Agnes could say something
yeah, sure.
afterwards.
I'll keep it brief.
About the project, yeah.
I'm speaking totally selfishly in how it's benefiting me and sort of giving me ideas, really. And I think it goes without saying that, you know, it's coming out with some really interesting ideas about this sort of new possible methodology. And what I particularly like is the way that you're very generous with your findings. You know, I find the website's really outward reaching. So even before I heard papers by Flavia and Susanna and Luciana, you know, I was already, you appear in the book, I think, at some point, you know, because you've made available the text and sometimes the videos of your previous events. I think that's really important, and it's a great resource for research, but also for teaching as well. So I was going to say a bit more about the three of you and you know, how you are helping me with my work and giving me ideas, but I haven't got time. But I think two things in terms of, you know, where we could take this. And again, I'm just thinking selfishly about my own interests, but I think perhaps we could focus more now on how intermedial connections impact on audiences and what that, you know, bring in more work on reception. Particularly in the historical context, you know, how did audiences make sense of these films because of the way that they are engaging with other media, but it could be something that could, you know, might be useful for contemporary cinema as well. And it also made me think about my own work on stardom. And if you think of kind of particular stars as being kind of vectors of intermediality, what new light might that shed on star studies as well, you know, and how this adds, several people have used this kind of idea of layered meanings, and how the kind of intermedial persona or a figure might add, and if you link this in with how this affects reception as well, I think the two things kind of come together. So that's something that it's kind of fired me up to go away and think about. And there's been so many interesting ideas as well. I think, you know, I think Tiago mentioned the other day, you know, where does intermediality begin and media archaeology start? I think that's really interesting. Stefan Solomon's presentation I really enjoyed. You know, when we're talking about intermediality, how do we define the media? Is it art forms and technologies, or is it other things like light, which I found fascinating? And you know, and is Hollywood a distinct media, as Ana Lopez said as well? So lots of food for thought, and I'd just like to congratulate you, because I just think it's a fantastic project, and I'm sure all of us are going to go away with new ideas and energy to pursue them. So thanks, Lucy, and all the team.
Would you have something?
Just maybe one sentence, very, very brief reflection on the convergences of our researches. I find it very, very interesting and thought-provoking that we heard here so many papers about the relationship of Brazilian cinema and Hollywood musicals, and which is fascinating, of course, and which shows for me the importance of interculturality, the importance of these trans dimensions in intermediality, transculturality, all these movements from one culture to the other, and the enormous gap, may I say that, between this one and what we have in contemporary, which is unfair to say, of course, because we should compare it to contemporary Brazilian cinema, but in contemporary Eastern European cinema, what we see is never a cultural connection to Hollywood. It's always a cultural connection, problematized, a very tensional relationship shown in these films with European art, European painting, European art, so or European cinema. So the Europeanness, what I referred to, is very important and a very tensional problem here. So for Brazil, this is so far away. Hollywood is obviously close.
Yeah,
than
but that
that one.
was one
Yes.
period of Brazilian cinema, and
Yes, that's
we
why I say
had-
it's unfair to compare these
The-
two things.
It's a pity that this is more or less in the middle of the
Yes.
expositions of all the strands of our project. But if you have the patience to stay on a little bit, you're going to be hearing a little bit about how contemporary Brazilian cinema dialogues with other arts
And I imagine this is also an important issue there, so interculturality, so
Yes.
not just media, but
that aspect
and questions of identity articulated through relationship between different cultures, different media.
That's the coming attractions
Yes.
in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for
you.
wonderful
Thank
talk
you.
and generosity.